Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The Greater St. Stephen Full Gospel Baptist Church, pastored by Pastor Deborah B. Morton, welcomes you to a greater experience.
Amen, man. I am just excited about what God is getting ready to do in this place on the day. Again, we thank God for our pastor for giving us the opportunity to share with you on today. We do honor her and our co-pastor, to all of our church council and our leaders, elders, ministers, all those who are here, deacons, officers. We thank God for our second assistant who's out preaching, sharing with Pastor Tyrone Smith today as they're opening their new church. Let's continue to keep Elder Henderson in prayers, my preaching brother on today. Thank God for my mother, Minister Adrian Boutin, who's sharing with us on today. Again, we want to remember on next week as we get ready to celebrate our pastor, Dr. Ralph West is going to be sharing with us on the first Sunday night. So we definitely want to do that as we kick off her anniversary. So please, let's make sure that we do that as well. Well, the word of the Lord can be found today in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah, the 54th chapter. Oh, man, I'm excited. I don't know. I've been praying and fasting all week, and I said, this wasn't what I had planned to preach, but Friday morning, God shifted something in my spirit and said, this is something that the people of God need to hear on today. So Isaiah, the 54th chapter, and we're going to start reading at verse 2. Isaiah 54 and 2, and we're going to read some of the following verses. This is what it says. Enlarge the place of thy tent, and let them stretch forth the curtains of thy habitations. Spare not, lengthen thy cords, and strengthen thy stakes. For thou shalt break forth on the right hand and on the left, and thy seed shall inherit the Gentiles, and make desolate cities to be inhabited. Fear not, for thou shalt not be ashamed, neither be thou confounded, for thou shalt not be put to shame. For thou shalt forget the shame of thy youth, and shalt not remember the reproach of thy widowhood any more. But can I go to another verse? Verse 17. Can we drop down to verse 17 on this morning? Verse 17 says, no weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord. No, look at somebody, tell them, no weapon that's formed against me shall prosper. And if I could just speak to somebody prophetically, I think this is going to resonate in your spirit on this morning. I just see somebody's been going through something, and God gave me this word specifically for you. I don't know if it's for everybody in this place, but I know it's for somebody. But this is what the Lord gave me for a title this morning: Surrounded by Enemies, but God will deliver. Surrounded by enemies, but God will deliver. It's time to shout. It's time to shout. I don't know who that's for. So it's somebody that I just felt that in my spirit. It's time. I've been surrounded by enemies. I've been surrounded. I came to speak to somebody who's been surrounded by enemies. Maybe I can get a witness on streaming, or maybe I can get a witness on Facebook or Twitter, but maybe I know there's somebody who walked through the doors of this church today, said you find yourself surrounded by enemies, but I came to speak to you prophetically this morning and tell you that even no matter what your situation is, God will deliver. So guess what? I got good news for you on this morning. It's time to shout. It's time to shout. It's time to shout. It's time to shout. I'm speaking to somebody's spirit. It's time to shout. It's time to shout. It's time to run. It's time to get up out that. It's time to shake up all that stuff. It's time to get out of that funk you've been in. It's time to get out all those things and let go all those things. That it's time to shout in this place this morning. Yes. It's time to shout. I came because this word is rich. Ooh, sit down. I'll get me excited. That's why I've been waiting to get this out, because somebody needed to know it's time to shout. I felt that in my spirit that some of us may find ourselves, no matter where you are in life, you have found yourself surrounded by enemies. Surrounded by enemies, encompassed by enemies, encircled by enemies. You found yourself encompassed on your job. Co-workers and those your bosses conspiring against you, trying to bring you down. They're conspiring. You got enemies around. You don't know who to trust. You don't know who to talk to. Can't talk to nobody on your job, because every time you tell somebody something in private or in secrecy, they go back and take it and use it against you. You're surrounded by enemies on your job, surrounded by enemies. Sometimes your enemies could be right in your own house. Sometimes I find myself surrounded by enemies in my house. My husband is acting up, or my wife is acting up. The wife's tripping, the husband acting up, the children crazy. Husbands hating on wives hating on husbands. They got strife and contention and bitterness in your own house, and you find yourself surrounded by enemies in your own house. Maybe you find yourself surrounded by crazy people in your family, cousins acting up, brothers acting up, sisters just ignorant. They just ignorant. They ain't doing nothing. They just aggravating your nerves. Just ignorant. I didn't say ignorant. I said ignorant. You know them ignorant people. You say, man, y'all just ignorant. Surrounded by enemies. I got enemies everywhere around me in my family. Maybe you're surrounded by enemies in school. Some of my college students know what's going on. I'm surrounded by enemies in school. It's like teachers just trying to fail me. Listen, they just got it out for me. They're just trying to get me. But then I got teachers who surrounded by enemies in your class. Them students trying to raise your blood pressure up, trying to drive you through a route. You're surrounded by enemies in school, surrounded by enemies even in church. How many of you know they got some devils in church? Oh, they got some. Oh, it looks like somebody that's been surrounded by some enemies in church. How they got some devils in church that's smiling in your face, but always trying to take your place. The backstabbers. I'm surrounded by enemies even in church. Surrounded by enemies even in life. They got some friends that you hang around that's secretly trying to make you go backwards, trying to make you go back into an old lifestyle that God has delivered you out of, trying to make you go back to that thing you said you never go back to. You got some friends around you that's really your enemies. They got a crab mentality that every time you try to go up, they right there trying to pull you back down because they really don't want to see you succeed. You're surrounded by enemies even with your friends, and sometimes in life they're just some enemies. They're just some people that's around you just trying to make you go backwards. Well, guess what? Sometimes the enemy that's surrounding you can, guess what, actually be in me. Sometimes the enemy can be right there on the inside of you. There are enemies all around us, enemies in my mind, enemies in my flesh, trying to make me go against that which is spiritual, trying to get me to fall into carnality, that thing which is not pleasing to God. There are some enemies that are encircling themselves around me, and these enemies that keep circling around me, they keep trying to push me. My enemies keep trying to push me, but I'm trying to tell them, don't push me now because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder, how do I keep from going under? Because these enemies keep trying to push me. I'm surrounded by enemies. How do I keep from going under? I'm talking to somebody's spirit today. How do I keep from going under? But I came to prophetically declare something to you. Those who may find yourself going under, those who may find yourself surrounded by so many enemies, I came to speak to you this morning, and guess what? To tell you that God has not forgotten you. God has not forgotten where you are. God did not leave you by yourself. You may feel like you're by yourself. You may feel like you have nobody else to turn to. But God told me to tell you he has not forgotten about you. And before this service is over today, you gonna shout. You gonna shout today before this service is over, because God will. He will deliver. He will deliver on today. So as we dive into this text this morning, we find the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah, whose name means the Lord has saved. He's speaking to the servants in this passage. And sometimes in the book of Isaiah, when you look at chapters 40 through 66, some scholars call that the servant passages. Speaking to the servants are sometimes called the remnant, a select few, a certain group. You see, like I told you this morning, this was a prophetic word that God gave me to come speak to the remnant in here today. Yeah, I'm talking to the remnant. There's a select few of us in this church that God is prophetically speaking to. The word is for you today. Look at your neighbor, tell him, I'm part of the remnant. I'm part of the chosen, the select few. So Isaiah was speaking to the remnant. So why was this passage written? Why was this text written? Why did God have to speak to the remnant? Why was this here? Well, if you don't mind, can I go back and walk through history? Do you mind? Okay, thank you for letting me walk back through history this morning. Let's go back to Sunday school if you don't mind, because my Sunday school is in the house. Let's go back and walk through history if you don't mind, and understand why this text was written, why we're at this place today. You see, God initially began to carve out a people for his name, a people who would soon be called the nation of Israel. He established the covenant with Abraham. Then he established the covenant with Abraham. Then through Abraham, he gave him Isaac, through whom the covenant would continue. Isaac then fathered Esau and Jacob. But then God chose to use Jacob, that trickster. Y'all know about Jacob, the trickster. God chose to use him to carry on the covenant promise. Don't matter where you are in life, God can still use you, even if you are a trickster. God said, he used the trickster to carry on the covenant promise. Jacob had 12 sons who later became the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel, these 12 tribes now settled in Egypt. And then while they settled in Egypt, at some point the Egyptians then enslaved them. These 12 tribes, these children of Israel, were enslaved for 430 years. But then after 430 years, God sent a man by the name of Moses to come in and free them from their slavery. Moses freed them. You've heard the story about how he led them through the Red Sea, how God could make a way out of no way. I don't care what your situation is. When you got Pharaoh and your enemies behind you and a Red Sea in front of you, God has a way of making a highway out of no way. God sent Moses to free them. They walked across the Red Sea, and then they settled there. They were on their way to the promised land, but on their way to the promised land, after God gave them the 10 commandments that we're talking about in Bible study with Pastor D, somewhere along that line, the people rebelled. Israel rebelled against Moses, rebelled against God's word, rebelled against God's commandment, and so because of that, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. After wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, Moses died, and then Joshua took over and led them into the promised land. But still in the promised land, they faced some enemies. How many of you going to have enemies everywhere you go? Even in your promised land, they're going to still have enemies. They still face enemies and giants in the promised land. And after years of fighting with their enemies in the promised land, the children of Israel decided, we want a king. I don't want the judge no more. I want a king, Dr. Bob. They wanted kings, Dr. Bob. That's what they wanted in the promised land. They faced enemies and they wanted a king, so God gave them Saul. He gave him a king by the name of Saul. And then Saul won a few battles, but the king Saul didn't fully follow the Lord. So because Saul didn't fully follow the Lord raised up another king by the name of David. We know about David. David was raised up as king. He conquered some enemies and secured Israel's borders. And then what David conquered, his son Solomon exploited economically. Solomon, the king, the wisest man, the richest man. Solomon was a great king. But then after Solomon's death, the kingdom was divided. It was divided into north and southern Israel. Sometimes they call Israel and Judah, and both of these kingdoms faced challenges. They faced challenges because of idolatry and foreign religious purposes. They started going after God had brought them out. Isn't it something? The very things we ask God to deliver us from, sometimes we end up falling right back into those things. They fell into idolatry and foreign religions crept in. Why did they do that? Because Solomon, as wise as he was, he had a weakness for women. Solomon loved women. The Bible said he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Man, he loved him some women. But what happened? Even though he loved all those women, the women that he loved worshiped other gods. You got to be careful who you lay with. Because when Solomon started laying with these women and they worship other gods, they eventually turned his heart away from God. So Solomon started allowing all these other foreign worships to come in and corrupt the thing that God called holy. And so then we have Jeroboam, who comes in after Solomon, the first king of the northern tribes of Israel. He tried to keep Judah away from that stuff. But then under Ahab, a few years later, Israel sank to her lowest spiritual depths. Now this nation whom God had carved for himself, who he had set apart specifically for him, is at their lowest point. They have totally turned their back on God. And so because they've turned their back on God, God says, I loved you so much that sometimes I have to discipline you. Sometimes when you fall away from God, he has to do some things to discipline you. He has to whip you to get you back in line because he loves you. So you may be going through your back.